Good morning. Good morning. Oh. So for those who are playing gotcha, it doesn't apply right now. Okay. Yeah. So we are continuing the theme of music and STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And last week we had an electrical engineering professor talking about music search engine. And today we have a music professor talking about music evolution through technology. It is an honor for me to introduce Professor Ron Steiger. So he is a past chairman of the music department at UC San Diego and the composer in residence of California Institute of Telecommunications and Information Technology, or CalIT2. And we are in the CalIT2 auditorium right now. So Professor Steiger is a conductor and a composer. His compositions have been played and commissioned by many leading ensembles and organizations, such as Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra, San Diego Symphony, and many others. Recently, his interest is in combination of traditional instruments and real-time digital audio signal processing and specialization, such as Ecosphere for large ensembles. Previously, he collaborated on a project of networked high-performance computer graphic and music with a grant from Intel Research Council, which seems to me very unusual for a musician. And he's a conductor. He conducts many contemporary works. So I cannot wait to hear what Professor Steiger has prepared for us. So let's thank him. Yeah. Welcome.
Good morning. 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 Okay, let's go to the real microphone now. Hi, everyone. Good morning. It's really a pleasure to be here to talk with you this morning. And can I just take an informal survey for a second? How many of you play a musical instrument? That's really great to see. I'm really glad to see that. How many of you had music classes in your schools when you were growing up? Really glad to see that. Great. Well, okay, so let me just bring up my, my presentation here, and then we'll get started. Okay, so you get what I was doing there a moment ago. I was speaking into a microphone connected to my laptop via an analog to digital converter. And the mic signal was being processed using real-time digital signal processing software, more specifically delay, pitch shifting, and spatialization processes written in Max MSP. And then the signal was reconverted with a multi-channel digital to analog converter and sent to 6 amplified loudspeakers all around the theater. Thus, when I said good morning, you heard many good mornings, and I'll go back to that and we'll play with it again a little bit later in more detail. So, as I was so graciously introduced there, you know that I'm a composer and a professor in the Department of Music here at UCSD, and I'm also a composer in residence at CalIT2. Now, some of you may be thinking, composer in residence? Why on earth does CalIT2 have a composer in residence? And maybe you're even thinking, why is he here talking to us? So you can consider my talk this morning to be a kind of long answer to that question. Music and science have evolved together and informed each other throughout history. And over the past 500 years, music and technology have similarly evolved together. Today, I'll talk a little bit about that and about my own research and musical pursuits. But first, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my background, give you some sense of what I studied, how I grew up, what I grew up doing, and how I got to doing what I do today. And I'm doing this also because I'm 54 years old. I graduated high school and went to college in 1975, and that's just when electronic and computer music was coming of age. So throughout my career, I've seen a remarkable evolution of technology, and so I'm going to give you a very quick sort of journey through that with me. So I grew up in New York City. After playing a number of different musical instruments in elementary school, when my parents heard me attempt to play the violin, they finally agreed to let me buy a drum set, which is what I always wanted to do. And from then on, I played drums in rock bands up through the start of high school. Here's my high school rock band. That's what I looked like back then, playing in my backyard in Queens, New York. I had the good fortune to attend the High School of Music and Art, a public school that was attended by many of the most talented and ambitious young musicians in New York. And there I was introduced to classical music and began playing orchestral percussion. And just as I had written songs for my bands, when I was playing in rock bands, I immediately was drawn to the idea of composing for orchestra. But I was also really into gadgets. When I got my hands on tape recorders for the first time around 1970, when I was a young teenager, I had a great time recording weird sounds back and forth between two machines and building up sound collages. I just thought of it as a strange hobby. I didn't really think of it as music. But I was drawn to it more for the technology than for the sound. I just thought these things were really cool. That was sort of the state of the art when I was in junior high school. So you can imagine my excitement when I found out that my high school music director had purchased an analog synthesizer made by a company called ARP. So this is now around early 70s, around 1974. This was a real breakthrough, this portable analog synthesizer. And they were very hard to find, and to get my hands on it in high school was really exciting. It sat in a big closet, and nobody knew what to do with it. Whenever I could, I went in there and started figuring out what I could do with it. It was the coolest gadget I had ever seen, and it made music, sort of. But it was still just a weird hobby, not really a part of my music making, which I was becoming very serious about. I went on to get my undergraduate education at a music conservatory called the Manhattan School of Music that had one of the best electronic music studios in New York City. This is an ARP 2500 analog synthesizer. How many of you have seen a movie called Close Encounters of the Third Kind? Have you seen that movie? There's the final scene in that movie when there's the incredible moment when communication goes on between the people on Earth and these aliens that come from outer space. The device that they roll out, that they use to communicate with the aliens, is an ARP 2500 analog synthesizer right here. Although those of us who know electronic music know that it's very ironic, because when it starts making sounds, it's actually not the sound of the synthesizer in that movie, but rather John Williams' orchestral sounds played by musical instruments. So it's one of those moments where if you know what's going on, you can't quite really enjoy the movie the way you're supposed to. But next time you see that movie, you can look for this big device that they roll out there. Anyway, we had one of those at my college, and where was I? So while I was studying all about music theory and history and learning how to write for orchestral instruments like the oboe and the trumpet, I also learned the theory and practice of electronic music, which was at the time a new frontier that musicians were very excited about. In my senior year, I got my hands on a computer for the very first time. It was a Commodore PET microcomputer that had a 6-inch green screen and 8 kilobytes of memory. That's kilobytes, not megabytes, not gigabytes, kilobytes. Programs were stored on audio cassette tapes and took a long time to save and retrieve. But what was so fantastic about this was that the computer was hooked up to a digital to analog converter that allowed the computer to control the analog synthesizers in the studios and a new custom-built hybrid synthesizer, potentially enabling us to do much more with them. So here I am with the PET, and here's the custom-built synthesizer that was hooked up to it. There's the synthesizer. But there was no software, only the basic programming language. And that was too slow to do anything musically interesting. So I had to resort to machine language subroutines, which basically meant writing software in strings of hexadecimal numbers. There's the instruction set for the 6802 processor, which was the processor in that computer. It was really interesting learning about computers at that time, because to make a computer do anything at that time, you had to actually know what was going on inside the computer, what the architecture of the microprocessor was, what the instruction set was, how the computer moved data around, because there weren't any software applications. So if you wanted to use a computer to do stuff like making music, you had to get involved with writing programs on a very low fundamental level. And so I feel like I understand computers in a way that I wouldn't have if I was starting to learn about them now, because there's really no incentive to go deeply into understanding the way things work inside when you've got really slick applications doing everything for you on the surface. Well, that's where I started with computers. The following year, I moved on to attend graduate school at California Institute of the Arts, where I was engaged as a research assistant to write software for the Buchla 500 system, seen here. This, too, was a hybrid system that used a mini computer programmed from a teletype terminal to control analog modules. Needless to say, things are a lot better now. But it has been very exciting being at the cutting edge of electronic and computer music, because things just have gotten more possible and more interesting, little by little by little. So here I am in 1983, a few years later, preparing for a concert at MIT in the early days of the Media Lab, using a Buchla 300 analog-digital hybrid synthesizer. So just so you know what's going on here, so here again, there was a computer that was sending out control signals that was being used to control a lot of different analog devices, and this big mess of cables was the way everything was interconnected. So you were using devices which were controlled by a computer to make sounds and to control those sounds and change them in real time. Real-time use of these things was just becoming possible. Up until the 70s, the early experiments with computer music were done in non-real time, where you would write code and then let it render on the computer for several hours, and then get one little sound back. And if you made a mistake in your punctuation, that sound would be just noise. So being able to do stuff, turn a knob and hear the result right away was a big breakthrough at this period in time. So a couple of years later, here I am with Peter Otto, who's now the Director of Audio Research here at Cal IT, back in 1985 in a studio at the California Institute of the Arts, where we were both teaching at the time. You can see a first-generation Macintosh, a Yamaha TX-802 FM synthesizer, and the first sampling synthesizer, which was called an emulator, made by a company, Emu. Both of those devices had revolutionary impact, particularly on popular music. Popular music started to change dramatically when these types of devices became available for musicians. Up until that time, all the popular music you hear was basically played by drums, bass, and guitar, and sometimes piano and organ. But everything started getting seriously electronic around the time, particularly because of this thing called the emulator. Now, before I go further with telling you about what I'm working on now and the things I've worked on after what I just showed you, let me go back to something I said before about the relationship between music and technology. Musical instruments and the expression they enable are among humankind's greatest achievements. As long as people have played music, inventing and improving musical instruments has played a central role in the evolution of music. Particularly since the 18th century, a symbiotic relationship between performers, composers, and instrument builders has driven this development, motivated by the desire for greater virtuosity and expressivity. For much of that history, this was demonstrated in the mechanical domain with the physical development of the instruments. For example, let's consider the oboe, an important wind instrument in the modern orchestra. We can actually see precursors of the oboe dating back to the ancient Greeks. And now here's what the oboe looked like in 1774. And here you can see the way the instrument evolved over the next 150 years. Get the cursor there, yeah. So there's the modern instrument we were looking at a moment ago. And you can see how the original wooden instrument had very little metal keys on it. And it gets more and more complicated coming up to the modern instrument. The shape was refined, the materials were refined to improve the beauty and power of the sound, and adding an increasingly complex key system to enable greater chromaticism and virtuosity. For another example, here's a trumpet from 1671. No, that's the oboe. There's the trumpet from 1671. Okay, so 350 years ago or so. Then 1886. And there's the modern trumpet that you're all familiar with. Let's go back again. There was a particularly inventive time in the mid to late 19th century when many new and interestingly altered instruments evolved, particularly in the brass family. Here's some particularly weird ones. If you ever go to Paris, there's a wonderful place called the Cité de Musique, which has the Muséum de Musique, which has an incredible collection of many of these weird instruments that were created in the late 19th century. There was a kind of a feeding frenzy of inventors trying to invent new instruments. That's when Adolphe Sax invented the saxophone. But there were a lot of instruments, besides the ones like the saxophone, that made it into the lexicon of instruments that we're familiar with and still using. There were a lot of instruments that were developed then that didn't go anywhere. And they're pretty amazing to see. These are just a few examples. So a huge community of musicians over the years contribute to the evolution of modern musical instruments that are capable of great subtlety and expressivity. And this energy began to move into the electrical domain at the end of the 19th century. Here we see the extraordinary Telharmonium, invented by Thaddeus Cahill in 1897, and later moved from Holyoke, Massachusetts to New York City in 30 boxcars, where he set up a business to send music generated by the Telharmonium over telephone wires to homes and businesses. Now, this really blew my mind when I heard about it for the first time, because I think of electrically produced music as something that's a much later phenomenon. I mean, the late 19th century, if you think about it, is just a little bit after the telephone was invented, just a little bit after the light bulb was invented, recording had only been, Tom Edison had just made the first cylinder recorder, broadcasting hadn't started yet. So this idea of building this big, huge device that actually produced music electrically and that could send music over the wires of this new telephone system was a pretty radical thing. Now, there were many other things that started to happen around as we get further into the 20th century. One of the more interesting ones was this instrument called the Theremin, which was invented by Leon Theremin in 1928, growing out of Russian research in proximity sensors. Theremin created an instrument that produced sound without physical contact, as the performer controlled the pitch and amplitude with the proximity of their hands to the antenna. I don't have a recording here, but you've heard the sound if you've ever watched any old horror movies. In Hollywood, this instrument was used a lot. It kind of sounded like that kind of thing. And this was the way that was produced. So there were many attempts at making electrical instruments. And then we get up to the time that I was showing you about before analog synthesizers in the 1960s and 70s. Two of the most influential synthesizer makers, you've probably heard one of the names, Robert Moog, who made the Moog synthesizer, or the Moog synthesizer. And there was a big kind of crossover moment when Wendy Carlos came out with an album called Switched on Bach in the late 60s, using a synthesizer like this to play the music of Bach. And it was a big sensation that brought a lot of attention to electronic music. Donald Buchla on the West Coast was another inventor of synthesizers who made these early analog synthesizers that began to evolve. And then there was a lot of creativity that went into making these things, and mostly into making them easier to use, more reliable, better sounding. And we had another really big breakthrough in the 1980s with when Yamaha came out with a synthesizer called the DX7, which was based on a patent or an algorithm that was patented at Stanford by a professor named John Chowning using frequency modulation synthesis. Dr. Chowning, FM had been around a long time. You've heard of FM radio. Frequency modulation was a technique that many people had used, and it was used in analog synthesizers. But Professor Chowning figured out a way to do frequency modulation with a computer that was very reliable and easy to control and made very beautiful sounds, and it kind of revolutionized the sound of electronic music. And Stanford patented the FM synthesis algorithm, and it turns out that as of a few years ago, this patent is the second most valuable patent in the history of Stanford University. The reason being that Yamaha licensed the patent and then started selling these DX7 synthesizers, which were wildly successful and was the most widely sold electronic instrument by far. But then they put this technology into little chips, which found their way onto the sound cards in first-generation sound cards for computers. So pretty much every PC that came out of the factory had this algorithm running on it to make sounds, and then the first generation of cell phone ringers. So a music professor was just trying to make a synthesizer sound better, but it turned into this huge, valuable patent that had impact on many things that he hadn't anticipated. Now, while development of new electronic musical instruments continues, for me and many other composers, the greatest musical potential lies in the work we can do in the realm of the signal. That is, taking sound from highly refined musical instruments that evolved over centuries, capturing that sound, converting it into data, then enhancing and transforming it to provide greater expressivity and power. You heard a little example of that with what I did with the microphone when I first started. Of course, this was impossible to do in real time until processor speeds became fast enough. And only in recent years has the musical potential for this kind of work begun to evolve. in large part due to the software environments developed by UCSD Music Department Professor Miller Puckett that have become the lingua franca of the computer music community. Sorry, I gave you the wrong slide. Here's Miller Puckett, who's the chair of the music department now. And this is a screen from one of his programs, which is called Max MSP. The big breakthrough that Professor Puckett created, this goes back to his work at the MIT Media Lab back in the late 80s, which he then took with him to a research institute in Paris, France, called IRCAM, and then finally he brought it here when we recruited him here to UCSD in the early 90s. I told you before about how I had to learn how to program in machine code in working with very complex things to make the computer do anything interesting musically. What Professor Puckett did was he developed software that had a graphical user interface that was very easy to grasp and understand, that allowed musicians to work with real-time signal processing and synthesis immediately. You would just put objects up on the screen, draw lines between them, and it would start producing sound. And this enabled, so it's a software environment. It's somewhere between a programming language and an application. And it enabled musicians who were previously unable to work with computers to do very complex and sophisticated things with computers. And now this program, Max MSP, and its successor, Pure Data, are used by thousands of musicians all over the world. Anyone who seriously works with computers to make music is using this software. There are user groups all over. There's plenty of information about it on the web. If you're curious, you can just go to Miller Puckett's website. He also, by the way, wrote an excellent textbook on computer music techniques and using his software to demonstrate them. And it's all on his website. The book is available for free in PDF form. And the software and the examples are available to download for free. So if you're curious about computer music and you want to learn more about it, this is a great way to do it, is go to his website. It's kind of the Khan Academy of computer music. It's a place to go and get interesting information and learn about it. And people are using this software all over. And it definitely changed my life, this software. I'm always going to be very grateful to Miller Puckett for it. Let's see, so give you a few examples of what I mean about signal processing of instruments. What I demonstrated before used delay lines and harmonizers. So what that means is that the sound of my voice went into the microphone, went into the computer. Here you see an oboe, but in other words, when I showed you this before, we went into the microphone, into an analog to digital converter. That signal went into my laptop, not the Commodore PET, but a computer. And then that data was transformed and then came out of the speakers. And the algorithms I was talking about, harmonizing, basically takes the sound, changes the pitch of the sound. And so you hear the same exact thing at a different frequency. I'll demonstrate this for you in a little bit. A delay is just like an echo. It means that the signal goes in and it comes out sometime later, and you can create lots of these to create echo effects. I also work with spatialization algorithms, delays, and filters to enable me to work with space as a compositional parameter, altering the acoustical conditions in which you hear the sound throughout the piece and moving sounds through space. I'll play you some examples of that in a moment. In other words, I can make the room sound like, it's very reverberant, like a gymnasium or a cathedral, or I could make it sound like it's a small concert hall or a large concert hall, and that can change over the course of a piece. So whereas before these kinds of algorithms, the acoustics of the hall were fixed and just what they were, now we're using signal processing. We can actually make it seem as though the acoustics in the room change over the course of the performance. And surround sound, you've all heard in movies, surround sound effects, maybe in a home theater system you have where sounds move around you. Well, we work with that in music now too, and I'll play you examples in a little bit so you can hear what I'm talking about. So a big part of my current research is working with Miller Puckett and other colleagues here at Cal IT2 and with music department graduate students to develop new signal processing techniques to apply to musical instruments or to voices. But even with faster computers and better software, it remains difficult for performers interested in playing these pieces to present them on concerts. Another area of research I'm embarking on is developing resources for a new series of solo pieces with signal processing that will make this much easier and reliable so that a modestly computer-literate performer with a laptop can download software and scores from my website and perform these pieces without me or an expert engineer present. One part of that is to deploy new developments in signal analysis and automatic score following that will allow the software to automatically synchronize the signal processing with the sounds played by the performer, giving the performer complete temporal freedom. Another area that needs considerable work is the way we get signals from the musical instruments to the computer. Consider the way we do that today. So here, again, the instrument has to play into a microphone. Then a cable has to carry that to an interface. That interface has to be calibrated and set up correctly. Then data has to go through another cable into a computer, etc. Where I would like to get is here, where traditional instruments would have sensors and transmitters built into them that derive audio signals and measure physical activity and transmit this wirelessly to computers, eliminating the need for the restrictive and somewhat unreliable prosthesis that we encumber performers with now. This will require collaboration between the best musical instrument builders with electrical engineers, creating another important step in the evolution of these instruments. We've seen this to some degree with the development of the electric guitar. How many of you have played electric guitar? So if you haven't played it, you've seen it, you know that a traditional guitar isn't hooked up to anything. It has a hollow body which resonates the sounds of the strings and makes them louder. But when the electric guitar was invented, magnetic microphone pickups were put into the guitar. It was turned into a hollow body guitar. The sound of the instrument itself without amplification is very weak, but you hook up the output of those microphones that's on the guitar to an amplifier, and you know the rest. This is an example of one of the only musical instruments where instrument builders actually worked with electrical engineers or were electrical engineers themselves and built sensors into the instrument itself. And that led to a whole new genre of music that you all grew up with. That hasn't happened for most musical instruments. The people who build oboes and violins and other musical instruments live in one world, and electrical engineers live in another world, and there's very little connection between them. That's something that I and a lot of my colleagues are trying to foster greater research and collaboration in. There are some interesting examples now. There have been a couple of attempts at building sensors into the violin. Miller Puckett, who I told you about a moment ago, is involved with a project now where a Bluetooth transmitter is built into the bow of the violin so that data from the movement of the bow can be transmitted to the computer. The computer can know exactly what the violinist is doing with the bow and then process that information to control electronic music. So there is some work going on in that area, but there's a lot still to do. And so really, we've only made baby steps. Much work remains to be done. And I'm hoping to draw my association with this institute to encourage and foster more of that kind of collaboration between traditional instrument builders and engineers. So now I'm going to depart from the slideshow, and I'm going to go back to doing a few examples of signal processing like I did when you first came in. And I'm also going to play you some excerpts from my music that use these techniques to give you some further ideas of the kinds of things that I've been talking about. So let me just play something for a moment. So that was a brief excerpt from a piece of mine called Ecosphere, which was a piece for a large chamber ensemble of 16 instruments that I was asked to write by a French ensemble, the Ensemble Intercontemporain, where all 16 instruments play into microphones and can be signal processed at any given time. This piece, which I did about 10 years ago, was one of the first pieces that deployed real-time signal processing with computers to a large ensemble of instruments to do things in real time. What you just heard more specifically was, at that moment in the piece, I wanted to simulate the sound of a storm. And what I did was I had a number of the wind players, oboe, flute, clarinet. Instead of playing their instruments the normal way, I just had them blow air through their instrument. And then took that sound from the microphones and put it through delays to multiply the sound, and then through a spatialization algorithm that moved it around among the speakers to kind of make it seem like it was blowing wind. And then percussion instruments start playing, cymbals and bass drums, going through a similar technique of being echoed and spatialized to create the sound of an artificial storm. Let's listen to that again. Another example of delays or echoes that I was describing before is from a moment earlier in the piece where there's a trombone solo accompanied by other instruments, but the trombone is echoed as if you were hearing a trombonist playing in a canyon. You know how you've all experienced that probably, where you've been someplace like Bryce Canyon or something like that, where if you call out, you hear your voice echo back to you maybe 2 seconds later, and then you hear it echo again, quieter and then quieter, because your voice is traveling at the speed of sound over a very long distance, hitting a hard surface and then bouncing back to you, and then hitting another surface and bouncing back. And each time it hits a surface, it loses amplitude, so it gets quieter, but you hear these echoes. And we can simulate that effect using a computer algorithm to create echoes. And so here's a trombone playing a solo into that kind of process. Oh, sorry. Oh, and another moment in the piece, there's a violin solo, and I wanted to create the effect of the violin having a kind of halo over it and have it fly around the room. So we used a process called Resonant Filters to create a lot of resonance of the sound of the violin, and then that resonance and the original violin signal together move around as the violin plays. violinist in the ensemble really liked this moment. She said it was like playing power violin, like almost as if she were an electric guitarist. Now, another example of a more complicated technique to explain, but a really intriguing one. There's one of the things that was just becoming possible at the time I did this piece was doing real-time FFTs, or fast Fourier transforms, where the sound could be analyzed and then resynthesized, and where you could do things with the signal without going into all the technical details of it. It allows you to do some very intriguing things with the signals, one of which is to take two different sounds and analyze them both, and then multiply one by the other, the data set for one by the other, and create a kind of a synthesis of both sounds, where the quality of one sound transforms the quality of another sound. And I'll try to explain it a little more, and I'll play you an example of it. In this part of the piece, there's an ensemble of string instruments that play chords. And then those chords are then being convolved or combined with low instruments, bass clarinet, trombone, string bass. And what you'll hear is you'll hear the string chords being played, you'll hear the low instruments being played, but then behind you, you'll hear this very weird sound, which is a combination of the two of them, where the signals are being analyzed and those analyses are being combined, creating a third sound that couldn't really be predicted by any of the original sounds. So there's the string, and then you'll hear in a moment the bass clarinet come in. So this is an area I was just scratching the surface, but it's a really intriguing one where you can take the sound of different instruments, combine them, make them into some other kind of sound that you haven't heard before. And there's a lot of interesting things that can be done in that domain. Let me play you one more musical example before, and then I'll show you a little bit of the software, and we'll go back to the microphone thing I was showing you before. Now, I've talked about all of these different techniques. There's other ones that I use that, as if they were just sort of like the pieces were just kinds of demonstrations of technology. But really, what it's about, as I said before, is finding new ways of being expressive musically. And I experiment with these things. I get the sounds in my head. And just as when I'm writing music for oboe or clarinet or violin, I'm thinking about the sounds that these algorithms can produce, and then writing music for them. And really the goal of it all is just to write interesting, compelling music that's interesting to listen to and that sounds different than what you've heard before, but not so different that it's alien. So I'm trying to write a kind of music that is at the same time familiar, but something you haven't heard before. So rather than focus on a specific technique, I just want to play for you about a minute of the end of a piece of mine called Dreamscape, which is a piece for cello, piano, percussion, and flute. And in this section of the piece, you'll hear those instruments playing without any transformation or processing, and then at different times you'll hear different processes applied. There'll be some spatialization, the sound will move around you. Sometimes you'll hear the piano sound normal, sometimes you'll hear the piano sound like it's strangely distorted using a technique called ring modulation. You'll hear the flute normally, then you'll hear the flute bigger and louder and echoed, etc. But so this is just to give you an example of a bunch of these techniques combined into a musical context where the goal isn't just to demonstrate technology, but to create a compelling musical experience. So if you were observing a live performance of this piece, you would see the 4 musicians on stage. They'd be playing into microphones. I'd be sitting somewhere out in the house with my laptop, processing the signals coming from the microphones, and then that would be going to the speakers around you, and those same effects would be happening that you just heard coming from the speakers. What you were just hearing was, I've released this piece. One of the problems up until very recently was if you wanted to put this music out on a CD, CDs are stereo. There are only 2 channels, so if it's a multi-channel piece, you lose that dimensionality. But because of home theater systems and DVDs, now we can release music like this on DVDs. So my most recent CD comes both with a CD and a DVD. The DVD has 5.1 mixes of the pieces, and if you have a home theater system, you can listen to them as you just were with the surround effect. And if you're curious to, in the odd chance that you're curious to know a little bit more about my music or about anything that I've talked to you about, my website is very easy to find. You can just go to Rand, my first name, RAND.info, rand.info. And on that website, I have a lot of audio excerpts, a lot of information about my pieces, information about the CD, DVD, and my contact information. And if you have any questions for me, I'd be more than happy to exchange email with you if you like more information about computer music, electronic music research, anything like that. I'm more than happy to correspond with you. I'd also be happy to meet with you afterwards if you want to come up and introduce yourself and ask me any questions. But before we end, I'm going to end like I began and pull the curtain back a little bit. Here is the interface for the signal processing algorithm that I used to echo my voice at the beginning. This is written in Max MSP, the program I was telling you about, which allows you to make user interfaces that show what's going on in the process, but also behind the screen, this is the programming environment where there are objects which represent different programming objects or signal processing techniques, and they're connected with these virtual wires. And you can see the signal flow, and you create your program like that, and then you create your user interface on the surface. And with a little luck, it'll still work. I'll turn it on, turn this up. Let's see. So this is a multi-voice harmonizer. You'll hear all 8 versions. So the original signal is coming through, plus each one of these is showing that there are 8 delay lines, which allow you to specify how much time the computer should wait before that output comes out. So what this says is take the sound, lower it by about 5 steps. So in other words, a C would become a G, and wait a half a second before it comes out. And so what you were hearing is 8 different things like that. These are the delay times: a half a second, a second, second and a half, 2 seconds, 2.5, 3, 3, 3. And these are different frequencies or different intervals for the pitch shifting. So again, I change to a different preset with different parameters. I increase the feedback. Let me do more. Wait a sec. That's going to go for a while because it's taking the output and feeding it back into the beginning and continuing to go. So the higher I turn up the feedback, the longer it would go. If I turn it up too much, it'll blow up. So I don't want to push it too much. So that's just one example. But if you're curious to be able to do transformations of sound, now if you've played around with music software, you know about plugins, you know that there's very easy to use, user-friendly little applications that you can use to transform sound. But what's so great about this software is it allows you to develop your own ways of transforming sound and be endlessly creative. And it's also a really interesting way of programming because you can program complicated real-time things immediately. And there are, in the Max MSP domain, there's all kinds of objects for real-time computer graphics, video processing, etc. So if you're interested in multimedia transformations, take a look at PD and Max MSP. It's a very interesting place to go. So thanks for listening, and nice to meet you all. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for a very fascinating talk. Yeah, so here's a little bit of something from Cosmos.
Thank you very much.
Okay, let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, one question.
Anyone have a question?
Hey, hi. So I was just wondering, does most of your music kind of rely on, say, like transforming orchestral music, or have you made anything kind of just by digital composition?
So the question, in other words, have I done just purely electronic music?
Yeah.
I haven't done that. There's a lot of great purely electronic music out there. Personally, I haven't really been interested in the sound of synthesized sound. It's not what I'm interested in. There's a lot of great music made that way, but I've always been fascinated with the idea of taking traditional musical instruments and transforming their sound. Having grown up with recorded music like all of you did, like a very profound thing for me was when I heard the Beatles album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, where they changed from, instead of just recording a performance of the band playing with guitar, drums, and bass, suddenly they were doing all kinds of things in the recording studio that you couldn't do anywhere but a recording studio, by transforming the sound of their voices, by transforming the sounds of instruments. And this showed great potential. And so from my point of view, I always wanted to do with classical instruments what rock musicians were doing in the recording studio. And so that's just my area of interest. There's a lot of really interesting digital music, synthesized music, but that's just not what I do. I'm more interested in working with orchestras and chamber musicians and transforming them sound with these types of algorithms.
Okay, thank
So,
you very much.
yeah, if anyone else has questions, feel free to come up and introduce yourself.